The SS Peregrine sliced through the inky void of space, its hull casting a faint silver glow as it descended toward an uncharted planet in the far reaches of the galaxy. Captain Lena Thorne sat in the command chair, her eyes fixed on the unfamiliar orb looming ahead. In the cockpit's cold, artificial light, her face was tense, taut with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was no ordinary planet. "Lena, that signal is getting stronger," called Dr. Miles Park, the ship's xenobiologist, from his console. His voice held a note of curiosity, mingling with a hint of unease. I don't know. Rhythmic, almost like a pulse." "Anything on the scanners?" Lena asked, her voice calm yet edged with intrigue. "Negative," replied Samira, the ship's chief engineer, her gaze fixed on the data readouts. "No life signs, not even bacterial. Atmosphere is thin, mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide. The surface is bone dry, maybe abandoned for centuries, if not millennia." "Interesting. Let's get closer," Lena replied, guiding the ship toward a large clearing that appeared on their monitor. The planet was a wasteland, its surface a bleached desert, punctuated by jagged rock formations and yawning chasms. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a world abandoned by life itself, left to erode and decay under the dim red glow of its aging sun. As the SS Peregrine touched down, the crew felt the faint rumble of its landing gear connecting with solid ground. Silence filled the ship's cabin as each crew member mentally prepared for what they might encounter. Lena stood up, her gaze intense. "All right, everyone, let's suit up. If there's anything out there worth discovering, we'll find it." Moments later, the team stepped onto the planet's surface, the soft hiss of their pressurized suits breaking the eerie stillness around them. Their boots left faint impressions in the dust-like soil, disturbing a landscape that had likely lain untouched for eons. A gust of wind swept across the ground, carrying with it a thin veil of red dust that swirled around their visors before dissipating into the barren landscape. Ahead of them, half buried in the ground, loomed an enormous structure that seemed to defy reason. It was a temple, ancient and alien in every sense of the word, its architecture both alluring and menacing. Towering spires of stone jutted into the air, carved with intricate, unfamiliar symbols that pulsed faintly with an almost organic light. The stones were smoothed from time and wind, but still held a sinister quality, as though they had been built to honor something ancient, something that demanded reverence or fear. "Those symbols," Dr. Miles murmured, stepping forward to examine the carvings more closely. "They're not like anything I've seen before. No recognizable language, but there's a coherence to them. Almost like they're alive." Samira brushed her gloved fingers across the surface of one of the stone spires. "They feel warm," she noted, her voice barely audible. "There's no sun strong enough to heat these stones like this. It's like they're generating their own warmth." "Could be residual energy from some kind of alien technology," Lena offered, her tone analytical. Yet even she felt the faint stirring of something uneasy. The temple loomed over them, casting shadows that seemed to shift, elongate, even curl slightly around their forms as if reaching, just out of sight. They approached the temple's entrance, a massive doorway framed by columns decorated with depictions of monstrous forms, creatures with elongated limbs, multiple eyes, and sharp, segmented bodies. These carvings spiraled along the edges, converging toward the center as if directing attention inward. Lena's pulse quickened, her breathing shallow. Her logical mind warred with the primal instinct that screamed at her to leave, to get her team back onto the ship and escape before something unseen awoke. "Looks like we're going inside," she said, steeling herself. She led the way, her flashlight slicing through the darkness within. The beam illuminated what seemed to be a large, circular chamber, its floor covered in a mosaic of shifting patterns that twisted and danced under the light. The air inside was cold, carrying a metallic scent that clung to their helmets. A low hum reverberated through the chamber, steady and relentless, like the slow, measured beat of a heart. It seeped into their bones, wrapping around their senses and rooting them in place. As they moved forward, the hum grew stronger, more pronounced, resonating in their chests. "That's unnatural," Miles whispered, his voice tense. "It's almost like it's reacting to us." The team moved cautiously through the chamber, their lights revealing walls covered with unfamiliar glyphs and images. Depictions of grotesque creatures filled every inch of the stone, their bodies warped, twisted, and fused in ways that defied nature. Some appeared half-finished, others seemed to be in various stages of transformation. They looked like half-frozen snapshots of something in pain, as if they were straining against the very stone that held them. They reached the far end of the chamber, where an enormous stone altar rose from the ground. Its surface was carved with intricate spirals and sigils, each line glowing faintly as if holding a memory of power. The altar held the remains of something, a skeletal form bound to the rock by strange organic tendrils that had long since calcified. Its jaw was frozen open, rows of teeth exposed, giving the impression of an eternal scream. Lena felt a shiver run through her as she examined the skeletal remains. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't a peaceful end," she muttered. Miles moved to inspect the skeleton, his hands trembling as he traced a finger over the calcified tendrils. These looked like they grew into it, almost like they were feeding on it. Samira shuddered, stepping back. "If this is a temple, what was it worshipping?" she asked, glancing around. Or maybe the better question is, what were they trying to keep out? Silence settled over them as they stood around the altar, each caught in their own thoughts, wrestling with the unease that had blossomed within their minds. The temple felt suffocating, oppressive, as if it were watching them with a cold, calculating gaze. Every instinct told them to leave, to abandon their mission and get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But Lena's curiosity won out, and she stepped forward, her hand resting on the altar as she leaned closer to the skeletal form. She didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible pulse that rippled from the stone as her hand made contact. It was subtle but undeniable, a quiet tremor that seemed to ripple outward, stirring the air around them. "Lena, did you feel that?" Miles asked, his voice barely a whisper. She pulled her hand back, her gaze narrowing. "It's probably just residual energy. This place is ancient. Who knows what kind of power source it once had?" But even as she said the words, doubt crept into her voice. She could feel something intangible shifting within the temple, a presence that seemed to press against the walls, watching and waiting. The hum intensified, a low, bone-deep resonance that filled the space around them, wrapping them in an embrace that felt almost alive. Each crew member exchanged uneasy glances, silently questioning whether they should proceed. And then, from somewhere deep within the temple, they heard it. A faint skittering sound just beyond the edge of their light. Something was moving, unseen yet undeniably present, tracing the contours of the darkness, waiting. Lena clenched her jaw, her flashlight sweeping the shadowed walls, catching glimpses of strange, shifting patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the hum. Her voice, though strained, held a note of steely resolve. "We've come this far. Let's find out what secrets this place holds." One by one, they stepped further into the darkness, leaving the relative safety of the entryway behind. The descent into the temple was slow, each step echoing into the murky depths with a heavy, ominous weight. The dim red light of the planet's distant sun faded, leaving only the narrow beams from the crew's flashlights to pierce the darkness. Each crew member moved cautiously, their breaths shallow, their footsteps almost reverent as they walked deeper into the heart of the ancient structure. "Stay close," Captain Lena Thorne whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. Her flashlight illuminated walls lined with intricate carvings, the symbols flowing together in a chaotic, almost hypnotic design that seemed to crawl under the surface. Every line, every groove felt alive, shifting as if the stone itself were imbued with something sentient. Each member of the crew felt it, a presence that hung heavy in the air, oppressive and filled with an unmistakable sense of malevolence. These symbols, they're different from the ones near the entrance, Dr. Miles Park muttered, his gloved hand brushing against a particularly ornate section of the wall. The carvings are sharper, more jagged, almost like they're showing something in pain. They stepped into a massive chamber, the ceiling stretching so high above them it vanished into darkness. At the center of the room lay a sprawling mosaic, a scene carved into the stone floor with such detail it almost seemed three-dimensional. Lena's light swept across it, revealing twisted forms and unnatural shapes, all contorted in agony, caught in a silent scream that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. Samira, their engineer, knelt down to inspect the mosaic, her flashlight highlighting every grotesque detail. "They're alien. Look at the limbs, the proportions. These creatures weren't human, and they don't match any known species either." Dr. Miles crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing as he studied the twisted figures. "They look like they're being transformed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "See how the limbs are stretched, the skin split open in places? It's as if they're being forcibly reshaped into something else." Lena's stomach churned as her flashlight caught another part of the mosaic. A figure at the center, much larger than the others, its body riddled with tendrils and chitinous growths, towering over the other tortured forms. Its mouth was a jagged maw, and its limbs branched out in unnatural directions, as though it were reaching to pull everything around it into itself. She felt a shiver run through her spine, a visceral reaction to the sight. This was no ordinary temple. It was a place of worship, yes, but the things it worshipped were beyond anything they could comprehend. "Let's keep moving," she ordered, tearing her gaze away. "There's more down here, and I have a feeling we haven't seen the worst of it." They moved deeper, following a narrow corridor that wound downward, twisting and turning as if intentionally disorienting them. The walls grew warmer as they descended, almost pulsing beneath their touch. Sweat collected inside their suits as the air thickened, becoming increasingly oppressive. The hum that had been a faint murmur at the surface grew louder, vibrating through their bones, an almost physical presence that gnawed at their nerves. At last, they emerged into another chamber, smaller but filled with rows of strange, grotesque statues. Each figure was unique, yet shared certain disturbing similarities. Elongated limbs, elongated mouths frozen in expressions of terror, and hollow eyes that seemed to follow them as they moved through the room. They appeared almost biological, as if they were not so much carved as transformed. "Are these real?" Samira whispered, reaching out to touch one of the statues. She recoiled immediately, her gloved hand jerking back as she felt something soft and yielding beneath the surface of the stone. "Careful," Dr. Miles cautioned, studying the statues with a horrified fascination. They look like they were once alive, maybe part of some ritual, a sacrifice. But something more happened here. These beings, they weren't just killed, they were changed. Lena glanced back at the statue, a sick feeling growing in her gut. The face of the creature was twisted in agony, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Small tendrils protruded from its eyes, curling outward in grotesque patterns. It looked less like a statue and more like a living being that had been caught mid-transformation into something else, something nightmarish. The unsettling thought was interrupted by a sudden shriek. It was Samira who had wandered slightly off, her light fixed on the far side of the room. The rest of the team rushed over, their beams converging on what she'd found. An altar similar to the one near the entrance, but this one held a body. It was alien, skeletal, yet unnervingly intact, with its skin stretched tight over bone and chitinous growths sprouting from every limb. But what caught their attention most were the veins, a network of dark, hardened tendrils winding through its flesh, binding it to the stone. "I think it's still alive," Miles whispered, horrified, watching as a faint shiver ran through the corpse, the tendrils pulsing ever so slightly. A sharp, metallic sound suddenly echoed through the room. It was subtle, like the scrape of bone against stone. They all froze, their breaths catching in their throats as something shifted in the darkness beyond the altar. A faint glimmer caught Lena's eye, and she swung her flashlight toward it, revealing a figure hunched against the far wall. It was Samira staring at her hand in horror. Her glove had somehow torn, exposing her skin to the open air, and her fingers were lengthening, twisting in unnatural directions. The flesh stretched and thinned, revealing dark veins that pulsed in sync with the hum that filled the room. She let out a strangled scream as her hand seemed to rebel against her body, twisting into something almost unrecognizable, the skin tight and translucent, her bones shifting beneath. "Get back to the ship," Lena barked, fear lacing her words. She grabbed Samira, pulling her away from the altar, but the floor beneath them seemed to shift, becoming soft, almost spongy, resisting their movements. The walls around them began to warp, undulating like muscle under a layer of skin, and the statue's empty eyes seemed to track their movements, their mouths stretching wider in silent screams of agony. "We're not alone here," Dr. Miles said, his voice trembling. "The temple, it's alive. Or something inside it is, and it's feeding off us, off our presence." With Samira's agonized whimpers filling the chamber, Lena's mind raced, desperate to make sense of what was happening. She could feel her own skin prickling, an uncomfortable heat radiating from the stone walls as if they were pumping energy into her, transforming her from the inside out. The glyphs on the walls pulsed faster now, flashing an ominous red, as if the entire structure had come alive, a sentient organism reacting to their intrusion. "We have to move," Lena whispered, the sound barely audible. Her flashlight caught another doorway at the far end of the chamber, and she guided the team toward it, pulling Samira along. They stumbled through the darkness, the hum now a throbbing roar in their skulls, vibrating their bones, echoing their own heartbeats. As they passed into the next corridor, the walls grew softer, pulsating with the sickly warmth that seeped through their suits. The path twisted and turned, branching into different corridors that only led them deeper, the temple's architecture shifting, becoming increasingly erratic, as if guiding them somewhere against their will. In a final chamber, they found it, the center of the temple, where a monstrous, half-formed creature lay suspended within the stone itself. Its body was an amalgamation of writhing tendrils, chitinous limbs, and half-formed eyes that opened and closed in different places on its body. A sickly green light pulsed from its core, casting an unnatural glow that seemed to warp the air around it. As Lena stared in horror, she realized the creature was incomplete, its form only partially realized, as if it were waiting, needing something to complete itself. And that something, she realized with a gut-wrenching horror, was them. "We're the sacrifices," she whispered, voice barely a breath. The temple wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The creature's eyes opened fully, each one focusing on the team with a terrible awareness. With a horrifying groan, it began to move, the stone around it cracking and peeling as if shedding skin. The walls constricted, the floor buckling beneath them, pulling them closer to the center, to the entity, which now twisted and reached out with grotesque, eager limbs. Lena gritted her teeth, the terror gripping her heart like a vice. She knew there was no easy way out of this ancient prison, and as the monstrous creature loomed closer, she realized their only hope was to find a way to stop the ritual, to break whatever connection bound the temple and this monstrosity before it, consumed them entirely. Continuation of the story, coming soon.